I think the best way to understand Kissinger's view of relations between the U.S. and, at the time, the Soviet Union is to contrast it with that of his successors, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Scrowcroft was in between them for a minute, but Brzezinski came in with Jimmy Carter, who followed Gerald Ford, and most of Ford's term, Kissinger had stayed on from Nixon's term. Nixon and Kissinger established a policy that they called détente, which was in essence a turnaround from the Cold War, the establishment of some warm relations and cooperation. They had some projects like joint space projects, a joint space station, and such things, and a general deconfliction of the relationship too. Um, that The following period was marked by a heightening of tensions again during the Carter administration. For example, Carter canceled the right. Brzezinski, who succeeded Kissinger, in essence stoked a conflict between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. He organized fighters against the government in Kabul in Afghanistan, and the government in turn had friendly relations with the Soviet Union and insisted on assistance from the Soviet Union to help them against the American-backed rebellion in the provinces. That led to a suspension of détente, the U.S. boycotting the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, and a whole bunch of other things. And it was this whole architecture that had been assembled by Kissinger was dismantled, beginning with Jimmy Carter's administration, and has more or less continued to this day, with the exception of the period, in the late 1980s between first Reagan in his second term and then George Bush, where they had again established some friendly relations. That again was undone, beginning with Bill Clinton extending NATO ultimately up to Russia's borders during the administration of Barack Obama. So Kissinger's view of relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and then later Russia was that mutually beneficial relations could be obtained and should be obtained because they were, in fact, mutually beneficial. Kissinger was pretty much the architect of that policy. The history of that was, Richard Nixon had made his name basically as a hardcore Cold Warrior, even prior to the rise of Joe McCarthy in the U.S. Congress and Senate, and he got himself national attention after the Chinese Revolution, 1949, raising the question of who lost China, as if China was a personal possession of Washington's. And he was noted as a hardcore Cold Warrior. He was, in fact, added to Eisenhower's ticket because Eisenhower was not considered a hardcore Cold Warrior. Eisenhower, of course, was the U.S. and Allied Supreme Commander in Europe, allied with the Soviet Army in the defeat of Germany. So he had a whole different view of things. Nixon was the cover for Eisenhower among the hardcore Republican vote that helped get Eisenhower elected. And he had that reputation all the way through his election in 1968. And he was promising to put a quick end to the Vietnam War with a secret plan. That carried weight among the voters because they believed he was just going to be, hard-nosed and was going to force the Soviet Union to stop backing Vietnam, and that would cause a collapse of North Vietnam. Instead, he followed a whole different track. Kissinger and Nixon played hardball militarily in Vietnam. In fact, many people, and this is a very good case for it legally, consider him a war criminal for what was done in Cambodia and Laos in 1970. They illegally bombed these non-combatants, and they devastated both countries. But the policy that was pursued was a policy of, mutual accommodation. There were, aside from just overall deconfliction arrangements between the militaries of the two countries and the two blocs, There were also treaties that were signed, for various types of nuclear arms. That that allowed a much greater degree of trust with inspections and other things. This again, it created a whole climate where the Soviet Union was here no longer looked at as an enemy, but more as a rival. I mean, contrast how the Soviet Union was viewed in the United States in 1975 with how it was viewed in 1952. Entirely different, where it was considered, the evil, and the anti god, anti human, all kinds of horrible caricatures of what the Soviet Union actually was. And then when Kissinger was gone, he was the architect of this policy to open relations. When he was gone, they went right back to that, with Reagan uttering "evil empire" 5 years later. So, we've seen what the Brzezinski model has produced, where we are pretty close to the brink of a war between Russia and the U.S. Hopefully not, but it's a very, very bad time in terms of relations between the two countries. The best outcome that could happen out of things right now, realistically, is that each one goes their own way and finds some way of surviving and thriving that way. Russia's certainly been doing that, just looking to the east. But the policy that Kissinger tried to implement, of course, is the most sane one. We're all on this planet. We're all human beings, as John Kennedy said. We all value our children's future, and we're all mortal. We should be finding ways to help each other survive and thrive. And whatever his motivations, Kissinger's, because it certainly wasn't altruism, his policies, tended in that direction. And it's rare over the periods since 1975 that that's the case in U.S. foreign policy. The case for war crimes against Henry Kissinger, of course, and Richard Nixon is very strong. But it should be kept in mind that this does not distinguish either of them from any of the other secretaries of state or presidents of the United States since certainly Lyndon Johnson, and all the way to date. I mean, Johnson was a war criminal. He started the war in Vietnam in earnest, sent 500,000 troops over there, illegally bombed the hell out of Vietnam for as long as he could. He was followed by Nixon and Kissinger. They were followed by Gerald Ford. I would say maybe Gerald Ford is one of the few presidents that can't be accused of being an outright war criminal. Followed by Jimmy Carter, who started the Afghanistan war, who did all the things around Iran, he got involved in Nicaragua and all of that. Ronald Reagan, the number of invasions of various places. You've got George H.W. Bush, who blew Iraq up the first time. You have Bill Clinton asked Yugoslavia or a number of countries in Africa about Bill Clinton and war crimes. And then followed by George W. Bush, Iraq and Afghanistan, etc. Followed by Barack Obama, Libya, Syria. Where do you want to go with that? Donald Trump, the assassination of Soleimani and blowing up the mother of all bombs near a mountain and a couple of camels, but he didn't actually start a war. So even though you could claim he's a war criminal rightly for the killing of Soleimani and perhaps a couple of other things, relatively speaking, he's the least indictable out of them. And Kissinger is, has in his column, his plus column, the fact that who knows what kind of war we would have ended up having between the U.S. and the Soviet Union if the policy didn't turn on its heels and reach the position of détente. Because when the Cold Warriors came back into power and the neocons with Reagan and Bush, they had to start from where Kissinger had left them rather than from where they were in 1968, because it would be very, long distance from where they were in 1968 to where we are right now. Only this would have happened in the 1980s or early 1990s, and we might not even be here if that had happened. There's, The United States is has a severe contradiction among the population based on pseudo-political differences. If you were going to color code it, you could say there's the blue team and the red team, the Republican and Democratic parties. There are, in essence, two um, cults that present themselves as political trends in the U.S. The people who consider themselves to the left, Democrats, not the Hillary Clinton types, but say the Bernie Sanders types, look at Kissinger as a war criminal because they vaguely remember some things about Cambodia and Laos, and also because he worked for a Republican president. Among the Republicans, they treated him as a Rockefeller Republican, quote unquote, which was not a hardcore ideologue in terms of neocon politics, but something different. And so he's also looked upon with some disdain by some of them. People on television define the legacy, of course. There's a whole, coverage from Fox News to MSNBC, Democracy Now, etc. Each one is presenting some small slice of the point of view, there that is absorbed and taken on by those among the population who are either part of the red-blue divide or outside of it. And then finally, there are those that actually know some history in the United States. They are admittedly in the minority, and they understand the role that Kissinger played, good, bad, and indifferent, and understand it within the terms of a materialist look at history. And I think the point of distinction to look at Kissinger is not that he's a war criminal like all the others, because that's what him being a war criminal really, that's the context for it. But rather that he is a war criminal, sought to find another path of relations where the existence of humanity might be at risk otherwise. For a while, he was featured in the gossip press as an eligible bachelor. So, the People magazine types or whatever tried to sell him as as a bon vivant, as a man about town or whatever. I've never met him. I don't know. My impression of him through the media is rather he was kind of a nerd, a policy wonk, etc. But who knows? That was part of his reputation, even if it was concocted by a PR firm. With respect to his, skills, quote unquote, or in any event, his time spent as a negotiator, that may well be part of the Kiss thing. Also, he was very convivial, personally very diplomatic, and so I don't know. I never had to encounter that with him, so I don't know how people perceived it when he was pouring on the charm, so to speak. But it's quite possible that was part of it. He did an about face over the last few months. He had been counseling, wherever it could be heard. He was writing and apparently speaking with, he had an advisory firm for foreign relations, and he had a personal relationship with a lot of the players, what the ones that we know, and also most likely the ones that we don't know, the deep state people who make policy. His advice, at least what was publicly released, was deconfliction. That there's too many things in common between Russia and the United States for the United States to try to freeze Russia out and to allow things to go into deep hostility. But in the last couple of months of his life, he had started with counseling Ukraine, for example, in the special operation in Ukraine, to concede Crimea and part of the Donbass and just say, look, you guys have to get along, your neighbors, try getting along. That was rejected, and they say it was rejected by Zelensky, but it was rejected by whoever pulls Zelensky's strings. And he turned around. He had a meeting with Zelensky a month or two ago, and had made some statements prior to that meeting that, in fact, Zelensky and Ukraine should stand strong against Russia, that it was very important that they get back all of the territory that they had before. So it's I would say, I don't know if he had maybe a stroke and lost his mind for the last month or two. The history of his career was quite different on that point up until the last month or two of his life. So he was 100 years old. If I can even be stupid when I'm 100 years old, I'll be happy because it means I'm not, in the ground yet. See, and what's interesting is that you have to look at the climate in the United States. Um, 2017 or 2018, I forget when, we went through this whole Russiagate thing here. Donald Trump is the personification of evil, and he was put in office by the other personification of evil, Mr. Hitler Putin. And that, I mean, that was the framing of the Trump presidency. And then Trump and Putin have a summit meeting, and in pages of the New York Times, they're calling for Trump to be, removed from office and tried for treason, which, by the way, carries a death penalty. On the editorial pages of the Times, that was the climate in which Henry Kissinger was saying, sane diplomatic things about President Putin. The President of the United States wasn't even allowed to do that.